Good evening. Welcome to Public Affairs Public Access on Houston Media Source TV. I'm Gene Preuss with Houston's League of Women Voters. Tonight, we're going to talk about an issue that we have avoided throughout most of the year, but it played very heavily into the legislative session. Now, we talked a lot about redistricting, but tonight we're going to talk about something else that affects public school children, and that is critical race theory. What is critical race theory? I've asked Dr. Vida Robertson from the University of Houston Downtown's Center for Critical Race Studies to explain the origins of critical race theory, how it came to be, what its tenets are, and what it means. Recently, just a couple of weeks ago, as a matter of fact, Representative Matt Krause from Fort Worth asked state superintendents to report on some 850 books that may have sexually explicit text, talk about human sexuality, sexually transmitted diseases, or contain material, and this is a quote, that might make students feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress because of their race or sex, or convey that a student, by virtue of their race or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. Now, this ties into House Bill 3979 that the legislature passed this year. This was the so-called critical race theory bill that Governor Abbott signed, and he had said more needed to be done, and he hoped that the legislature would take this up in special session. And so let's talk to Dr. Robertson. Dr. Robertson, first of all, let me thank you for being on the show with us this evening. I want to ask you a question about critical race studies in general. I think it's a topic that a lot of people talk about, and we've heard on the news and from politicians. And it's something that a lot of people are concerned about. But what is it? What is critical race studies?
Excellent. Well, Dr. Preuss, again, I want to thank you. Thank you for the opportunity and for the occasion to not only share with you as fellow scholars, but to clear the air about many of the misconceptions that are perceived about critical race theory. So number one, I would simply argue that critical race theory, it's a theoretical approach, and it's a frame of legal analysis primarily. And it's based on the premise that race is not a biological feature of our humanity. That is to say that we are not endowed by nature with this thing that we understand to be race. So if race is not biological, if it's not natural, then that means that race is sociological. It is critical race theorists would argue that race is a tool that is used to organize our society for the purpose of maintaining certain political, social, economic differences or disparities. And thus, critical race theory as a legal framework and as a theoretical approach is going to be a structural examination of this tool, this organizing tool called race, and the practices that we put in place called racism in our laws and our policies and our institutions and our systems and our structures that govern our American society. So fundamentally, that's what critical race studies is.
So we've heard a lot about when politicians have discussed critical race theory, critical race studies. They have kind of view it as almost un-American, that that there is something, it takes away from America and from the traditional story of Americanism that we've grown up in school learning about. And they talk about the tenets, almost as if it's a religious movement. Can you talk about some of these tenets, these core beliefs of critical race studies and theory?
Yeah, thank you again, Dr. Poy. Such a wonderful question, my friend. So yes, it is unfortunate that critical race theory has been characterized as un-American. I believe both myself and many would maintain that critical race theory is quintessentially American, but we need a longer conversation to have to really tease out those concepts. But let me offer you five central premises, five central or fundamental concepts that are at the basis of critical race theory. As I mentioned before, number one, that race is not biological, that we've known for a long time now that race is not a genetic it's not a genetic reality, that there are no chromosomes, that there are no genes, that there are no amino acids, that there are no physical markers for us to be able to extrapolate this incredible phenomenon that we fully embrace, especially in the Western world, called race. And so race is not biological, it is not natural, and therefore, as we mentioned again before, it is sociological. It is a construct. It's something that we've made up as a society, that we use as a society. And therefore, if race is a construct, it is a tool for organizing our society, then racism is normal, it's common, it's systematic. In the way that we organize the racial inequalities, the racial differences that are a part of our society. So that is to say that race wasn't simply something that one person can make up. We've all agreed that certain people are Black and certain people are white and certain people are Native and certain people are Asian and Latino, that we've agreed upon that. And that agreement has more to do with its function, that race is doing this thing for us as a society. And that thing that it's doing for us is quite normal. It's not extraordinary, it's common, and it's systematically implemented in everything that we do. And since race and racism are quite normal, we equally recognize that they are materially determined. That is to say that we invented this incredible concept called race, this incredible organizational tool called race, because race and racism advantage the dominant group. And therefore, any racial advancement and any racial equality will have to come at the only as the dominant group is willing to allow it to come into being. So race is based on a material advantage. We made this tool in order to construct the powerful and the powerless, citizens and non-citizens, determine who was human and who were not human. All of that was at the basis of our racial construction. That is to say that it is determined by our material reality. And therefore, those determinations, right, those inequalities that are constructed are in service of the dominant group who is using the tool to organize us. And hence, racial identity is a dynamic process. That means that since it is not natural, it is sociological, and it is a tool that is being used especially to privilege and to empower the dominant group, then it's going to change over time, right? So we know that when our Chinese brothers and sisters entered into the nation, we had as a designation white and Black. That white and Black designation came from our colonial period, but that was the way that we organized ourselves, because white and Black told us who were citizens and who were not citizens, who was going to be the slavers and who was going to be enslaved, who could vote, who could own land. That was the way we organized ourselves around this concept, this tool called race. But when our Asian American brothers and sisters entered into this racial matrix, they could not be white, so they had to be Black. So for a portion of our nation's history, what we now call to be Asian, we had not constructed that yet, right? We had not built that box yet. These peoples that we now call Asian were Black peoples. In the same way in which our Latino brothers and sisters would come into the body politic of America, right? We had already organized ourselves in a particular way. The Treaty of Hidalgo, right, is going to tell us that in order for our Latino, our Mexican American brothers and sisters to come into the nation, they must come in as citizens. That is to say that they are white peoples, because those were the only people who could be citizens in the United States in 1845. However, those white citizens were not given the same opportunities, were not given the same resources, were not governed by the same laws as their other white counterparts. So there are going to be incredible moments in our nation's history, as well as our own Texas history, where we're going to have Hernandez versus Texas, and Mr. Hernandez is going to argue, hey, there's no way that I'm a white American because I'm not given any of the privileges that white peoples are given in America. And of course, the Texas Supreme Court and of course, the Supreme Court of the United States are equally going to stand up and say, you're exactly right, that the racialization, the category that we created for you, is not in alignment with what we actually are saying. Race is a dynamic process. It's going to keep changing depending on the needs of the ruling class. It's not natural. It is simply sociological, and therefore it is always under interrogation and changing to meet the moment or the needs of the dominant group. And of course, the last thing would be, since these marginalized groups are at these intersections of politics and economics, of social structures and institutions, critical race theory is going to argue the insight that they have from living at that intersection, living in those bodies, being shaped by those systems, practices, and structures, are going to give them profound insight into the racialization process. And so critical race theory is going to privilege some of those voices, that if we are going to talk about what it means to be a woman in this nation, it should not be the men, the dominant group, who's speaking about what it means to be a woman. Critical race theory is going to privilege the voices of women in all of their array, right? Whether that is cisgender or transgender women, those bodies that live at those intersections, they, of course, are going to provide the most insight in how we can create the equitable space that we actually built into our Constitution. So I apologize, my friend, if that's a long definition, but I'm hoping that works.
No, that's actually great. So we looked at these four tenets, right? So that race is a social construct, that racism is systematic, it's inherent in the culture, and that that different people, we should have different voices, right? We should have different voices in the system. And so given these, if you go on the internet and people look or looking this stuff up, there's a lot of information out there. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, about, telling us what critical race theory is. How was it developed? What are the origins of this CRT?
Excellent question. I don't get that one often. The origins of critical race theory, some of the earliest critical race theorists are going, of course, it's a legal framework for analysis. So it begins in law schools. So the first African-American professor of law at Harvard University, his name is, of course, Dr. Derek Bell. He was a part of the NAACP's legal team that was a part of the Brown versus the Board of Education case. And so as Derek Bell is here working with the famous Thurgood Marshall, right, who would be the first African-American Supreme Court justice, they're here, and Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP are moving toward creating what they imagine to be racial equity. And the premise was that if we can just get Black children, right? If we can disrupt the racial system, right, between the privileged and the disadvantaged, between the haves and the have-nots, even as it happens with education, that Linda Brown was not given the same educational opportunities as her white counterparts. So here Thurgood Marshall, Derek Bell are pushing, and the NAACP will let's move Linda Brown into white schools. And that way, Black children would have access to the same resources, opportunities, and privileges that their white counterparts would have. So after this, of course, Brown is going to be a monumental moment in our nation's legal history, and of course is going to be at the forefront of an incredible social movement that we call the Civil Rights Movement. And here, Derek Bell is working through. Brown is going to run into all of these obstacles. And it's only after some 20 odd years or so that the nation is really moving toward desegregation, which was the fundamental premise of the NAACP's case. So Derek Bell is here now at Harvard University. He's looking back over what happened over the last 20, 25 years. And he has this famous quote where he says, "The worst thing that could ever happen finally occurred to me, that we got everything that we wanted and still nothing had changed." Derek Bell, going back over what they did and did not do in that Brown case, comes to the conclusion that it was not simply about that the premise of simply moving Black bodies into a white space. He, number one, come to realize that that was still white supremacist, that it had discounted all the things that African-American teachers had been doing in Black schools. It had discounted the notion that Black schools had anything to offer white America. It was simply moving us toward an assimilationist model, which is in itself inherently racist. That if we can just get these Black students into good white schools, then it'll all be fixed. It did not take into consideration that perhaps the schools themselves were racist. Perhaps the philosophy, the theory itself, the premise itself was fundamentally racist. So Bell, thinking over the Brown case, comes to recognize we desegregated not only Linda's school, but the entire nation, and still nothing about Black life or the opportunities of this young woman actually changed. So we must rethink the way that we understand race. And that moved him away from, as I tell my students, moved them away from looking for the villain that had always been the focus of our racial discourse, the bad guys who had always been a portion of a part of our racial discourse, into looking at the practices, the policies, and the procedures that maintain the inequalities. And so it's from this moment that he moves into a more systemic understanding of racism. Racism practiced by the institutions, that by not acknowledging the needs of the particular group of people, we blindly participate in the racist behavior that is inherent in our national system. And so from the time that we started this conversation, the inauguration of our country in 1776, we know that this country was not built for all of us. It was never intended to be for all of us. That the Native Americans whose land that our forefathers are standing on are right outside, and our forefathers never wrote them into the Constitution. They were neither people, nor were they ever going to be citizens. That the enslaved people who are building literally the infrastructure of the nation that we would call the United States of America are right outside the building, and our forefathers are writing, and they never imagined that they were actually people, nor were they ever supposed to be members of this nation. And all of our sisters who had always been a part of this American experience, who were just right outside this building, were never supposed to be a part of this experience. Derek Bell comes to this clear realization that you and I are now discussing, that America was never built for all of us. That phrase of perfecting our union was really only intended for a few. And all of its laws and all of its practices, most of its institutions were intended to propagate that dominant group. And so if we don't examine those practices, if we don't look at those policies, if we don't embrace it, then we will naturally carry out the fundamental basis of our American society. So this is the beginning of critical race theory.
Well, that's a really great introduction to the origins. And I'm struck by a couple of things. First, coming at it from I'm as a professional historian, coming at it from a history perspective. This is talking about attitudes and instances that have been pretty much explored by historians. Yeah. I mean, I think most historians would agree with much of what you were saying, that, all we have to do is look at Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, I think, 1856 decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford.
That's right.
And where Taney said that Blacks had no involvement in the creation of the United States and had no right to citizenship or being considered Americans, right? That their status as slaves was okay,
right?
Based upon that, which of course was ahistorical. One of the first. If you go up to Boston, one of the old cemeteries, there's a grave there. 4 people are buried. The remains of 4 people in this grave, and one of them is a man named Crispus Attucks.
Of course,
Crispus Attucks was the first person killed in the Boston Massacre, and he was at least half African American. Right. Fast forward this to Texas history, which is kind of my topic. And one of the first people recorded being injured in a battle of the Texas Revolution was a man named Samuel Mccullough. And Samuel Mccullough was half African American. So right. He's kind of, we like to say he's kind of the Crispus Attucks of Texas history. Texas, but, so that African Americans, that Black people have long been a part of American history. I mean, there's even Spanish conquistadors who were African,
right?
Which is something that we don't talk much about in the New World history, history of the Americas. But there were at least one. We know that in the 1500s that Blacks were on boats. Moorish people were on boats that were exploring with the Spanish, and so. There is this long history, and for a Chief Justice to say this, and it's that wordage is later on included in things like the Texas Declaration of Causes, the reason we left the Union in 1861, saying, well, because Blacks really their natural place is as slaves, as servants, and they had no role. And he kind of quotes Taney. So this is imbued in the culture, whether most Americans recognize it or not. Also, it's not unrealistic to say that, my family runs this town. We see this, everywhere. My family runs this town. So all the laws, even though we're not necessarily doing anything about other people, they're all going to benefit us, right? All the laws are going to benefit us. So, what you're saying doesn't seem that out of bounds, or I think what I've seen a lot of people get upset about is that they're afraid that, and they say that critical race theory, critical race studies blames everything on whites. Mm. And how do you respond to that? Is there a possibility? Does critical race studies? What would it say about a Black society or a Hispanic society? Can they be racist?
Of course. Of course. So again, my brother Preuss, I thank you for these brilliant questions, my friend. I think, and yeah, just thank you for asking that question, because it is that criticism is commonly laid on critical race theory. That critical race theory is inherently saying that all white people are bad. Now, again, if we go back to our fundamental concept, right? Whiteness is a sociological construct. There are no, critical race theory does not believe that there are any natural white people. There are no natural white people. There are peoples who've been designated as white. Now, again, we talked about premise number 4, that race changes over time. There are lots of our Jewish brethren who were not white, who end up being white much later in the 21st century, right? There are lots of our Irish brethren who in the 19th and 18th, 18th and 19th century were not white by every political, social practice in America, who will eventually become white. Our Italian brothers and sisters, our Polish brothers and sisters. So our history shows us, and you know better than I, people are moving in and out of whiteness, because whiteness is just a construct. It's just a category that speaks of one's access to resources, one's access to privileges, one's access to power. And there are people moving in and out of that designation. So critical race theorists would really talk about the dominant class. It would talk about whiteness. It wouldn't ever talk about white people, because white people, right, are constantly changing. Who's white today and who's white tomorrow? Those are different things. Many of our South Asian brothers and sisters in our American matrix, we don't see them as white, but according to the way that we organize our society, many of them are white peoples, right? So when we're talking about whiteness or the dominant class, we're simply talking about the social, political, economic arrangement that you just spoke of. That there are some peoples, right, who the laws and the practices and the procedures are benefiting at the cost of other peoples. Now, that goes directly against our commonly romantic belief that America is fair and America is equal. But you just beautifully pointed out, but that's not necessarily true, because the Supreme Court justice, one of the leaders of our American policy, said these people, no matter how long they've been here, no matter how much they've contributed, no matter what we think about, they can never, right? Tawney argued not only if they are enslaved or even if they're free, he actually undid rights that were already being practiced in the Northeast, right? That was our national policy. We said that these people weren't allowed in education. We did not allow them in our universities. We did not allow them to own land. We did not allow them to vote. That's not fair. Now, many of these practices, again, were to secure the resources, power, and opportunity for the dominant class. And so, to my white brothers and sisters, we are all struggling with whiteness. Even fair-skinned African-American men like myself, because of the aesthetic, right? We privilege whiteness. Because of the aesthetic, there are certain advantages that I have over my darker skinned brothers and sisters. That many of my Latino colleagues who are bilingual have, because they can practice the utilization of English as part of the tools that they use to negotiate this American space, they're going to have an advantage over their brothers and sisters who can only speak in a Spanish dialect. All of that has to do with the privileging of whiteness, not necessarily any biological group who are white peoples. So that makes all of us both participating in racism, because we equally engage in these institutions, are parts of these structures, are members of these organizations. And we also embody that racism. We will also, in the mates that we pick, in the choices that we often make, we have been conditioned to privilege, to appreciate, to to fundamentally hold up those peoples who the Constitution and our social practices have privileged in society. So critical race theory is not racist because, number one, it doesn't believe in race as a biological construct. And two, it's always only talking about power relations, how groups of people who've been designated as such interact with one another through the policies, the procedures, the practices of a said society. So of course, Latinos can be racist. Of course, African American or Black peoples or Black societies or Asian society, they can all be racist because they too are utilizing a sociological tool to categorize the powerful and the disadvantaged. I hope that helps. Oh, I think you got you on mute.
Analysis and something I don't think is often heard in the media. So I appreciate that explanation. Let me bring up another illustration from history. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, when many Americans across the board were suffering as a result of the stock market crash, the federal government, the Roosevelt administration, pushed forward an idea called Social Security, that we call Social Security, right? And in that act, there's no mention of race, no mention of any one group benefiting over another's, with the exception of two qualifications. Social Security, of course, as we know today, takes money out of our paycheck in order to set aside for later, except for two groups: domestic servants and agricultural workers were excluded from and historians have gone back later on and said, well, if we look at the history of those debates and why those two groups were excluded from Social Security, in order to get the vote of the South, which at that time Southern Democrats had great sway, we agreed to exclude people who were going to be African Americans and or Latinos, and a couple of other groups who made up the bulk of the agriculture. In California, those may have been Asians, and domestic workers. So even though on the face, right, prima facie, it is race neutral, in practice, it wasn't.
That's exactly right. That's an excellent example, Dr. Preuss, of the institutionalization of racism, because we would argue, as you beautifully pointed out, but why these workers? Why don't farm workers need money set aside for later? Wouldn't domestic servants need money for later? Why would we use those categorizations? What were we trying to solve, or for what reason did we make those delineations? And you argue, well, but when we look at the people who are occupying those particular occupations, we recognize that they are dominantly made up of a subordinate group. And so here we now have this social policy, we have this kind of economic resource, and it's systematically being denied to people who work here. Now, of course, there are going to be some Latinos who are going to be able to take advantage of it, some African Americans who are outside of it, but domestic workers, because of the way that we organized our society, it's going to be made up of, right? It was legal to say Black people are not allowed to apply for this job. It was legal to say that you cannot apply for this job, or our social practice would make sure that only certain people had access to the job posting or the education that was requisite for said job, so that we end up, as you mentioned, creating a racial disparity, even though the law itself never speaks of race, because the society, as we mentioned before, is using these intersectional, the economic system, the social system, the legal system, all of those systems are practicing together, so that the legal system didn't have to say, hey, we just don't want Latinos to be a part of this law. They should not have this resource. The social system had already done that. The economic system had already done that. so that the legal system would not have to do what these other two systems had already put in place, so that the law, again, as you mentioned, is racist in its implementation. Excellent point, my brother.
Not trying to steal your thunder on anything.
No. I think you are the man.
I'm just intrigued by the parallels and the overlap of what critical race theory is holding as opposed what is already being taught and has long been taught. It's really nothing new. So one of the things that we're seeing this year, the Texas legislature passed a bill called House Bill 3979,
right,
which has sometimes been called the Critical Race Studies Bill. And part of this was on the urging of Governor Greg Abbott, who was concerned about this theory, as he described it, being brought into the public schools, teaching high school or middle school or elementary school children these theories, and the concern that somehow that it was disruptive to the nature of what we as Americans like to believe about our nation and our country and our past, and that it was somehow un-American. Can you talk a little bit about that and about this controversy?
Yes, I appreciate the question, my brother. It's a wonderful question. It seems as though, I don't want to go too broadly politically, but we are at a moment where, through recent events, that we've become more conscious of the uneven practices of our nation. And so as a larger public, we are asking ourselves, okay, how is it possible for us to be racist when I'm a really good person, right? I mean, I'm a really good person. I'm a God-fearing man. I do my best to help other people. How could I possibly be racist? Because that's what I hear Dr. Robertson saying, is that that no matter what we are doing, that often we are engaged in producing unequal circumstances for different people because of the way they've been categorized. And so the nation is having a kind of awakening. We're asking critical questions. And part of that is asking us, okay, so we have fundamental texts in our education system. That I'm a literature professor, I teach literature and culture, and nobody ever asks us, is it going to be a problem teaching Shakespeare or Mark Twain? Are those ever? No, of course, those are great American writers. But right now, we're having a conversation on whether we should teach Toni Morrison. Is Toni Morrison not a Pulitzer Prize winning, Nobel Prize winning author? Like, what is this conversation that we're having? And what's happening is that the marginalized groups are saying, we have a history of leaving some of us out. That when we think about Thanksgiving that we just celebrated, we don't often appreciate a couple of things. Number one, we are often not celebrating the Native Americans who made made it possible for us to give thanks, because they helped us survive when we were starving on our boats, right? Freezing to death. They fed us and they taught us how to cultivate the land. And then they even offered us their infrastructure, right? That would allow us to build a country. So when we are Thanksgiving, you would imagine historically Native Americans would be at the heart of that. But because of our social practice, we only celebrate the Europeans. And not only do we only celebrate the Europeans, we equally fail to recognize, of course, in 1619, we know that that the first enslaved Africans are going to be are going to come here. So by 1620, when we lay out our national history, there are already people, not only are there Native Americans here, not only are our Spanish brothers and sisters who are helping us navigate these new lands, but there are also these enslaved Africans who are now already a part of our census and we see on the ledgers. But when we celebrate Thanksgiving, we don't think anything about Black people being present. And we know as a historical fact, this is not even debatable, that there were Black people there, that they were equally a part of this celebration. But the version of Thanksgiving that we hold dear, that we celebrate, centers whiteness. So many scholars, many instructors, many community organizers, politicians are asking themselves, hey, is this happening everywhere? I mean, if it's happening in Thanksgiving, if my kids are never coloring Africans in kindergarten coloring books when they do Thanksgiving, then if they're not there, then maybe they're not in our literary works, and maybe there are not enough of them in our historical explorations, and maybe we're not discussing them nearly enough in the way that we teach, the way that we learn, the way that we engage as a society. So there's been a big push for diversifying our curriculum and including more voices. That push to really represent our America in our curriculum has invited the dominant group to push back and say, but that's not the story of America that I remember. Yeah, but we would agree. You probably don't remember it because we systematically excluded these people because we centered and we prefer whiteness. So yes, this is a little different. Well, I don't like that version because it makes me feel uncomfortable. I get that. My question is always, think about all of our Native American brothers and sisters. Do we ever ask ourselves, what do Native Americans celebrate on the day that we are giving thanks for this nation? That's an interesting question. Do they have a turkey? The simple fact that we never ask the question says something about the way that we think about the problem. And so there are many folks in diversity, equity, and inclusion who are trying to diversify the way that we understand ourselves as Americans in hopes that it will lay the groundwork for engaging in a new American century that'll be much more inclusive in recognizing how diverse and beautiful, profound that we are as a democratic experiment. And so, unfortunately, there have been states and there have been legal bodies all over the nation who are attempting to keep this from happening. Again, as a critical race theorist, the argument is not if they're bad people, or the argument is not if they're wrong people. That's inconsequential as a critical race theorist. But what we do see is the supreme, right? That which is most important is whiteness. So white supremacy is taking center stage. And so we are constructing at this moment laws, House Bill 3979, where we say, hey, if our children are feeling uncomfortable because of all this inclusive work, all these diverse voices you're bringing in, then that's a problem. And as I said to one reporter, which children are we talking about? Because we were never talking about brown children. We weren't actually even writing the law for Black children, Native children, or Asian children. At the very heart of the law that we're passing, saying that critical race studies is a lie, is the premise of white supremacy. When white children and white parents feel uncomfortable, then, of course, they are going to be able to take action against the superintendent, against the teacher, against the school. Because Black children have been uncomfortable for some time now. And Latino children who are not being taught their history and their culture, they are not celebrated in the same way. They've been uncomfortable for a very long time. And our Asian American brothers and sisters who are almost absent from our university, high school, and elementary curriculum, they've been very uncomfortable for a long time. So this law itself, unfortunately, is an excellent example of the narrow-mindedness that is at the heart of the push to make whiteness our supreme reference. And so when white children, and that's where we're seeing it act out right? So if we're talking about South Lake, Texas, up in the South Lake, Texas, we see parents fighting in meetings about, they don't want these readings and how dare their children be exposed to what is just literature and the experiences of other people. Again, critical race theory would never say that white people are wrong or white people are evil or white people are bad, because there is no such thing as white people. They're just people who are been categorized as the dominant, the center of a society. And marginalized people are explaining that in this system and in this society that they are often pushed to the side, that they are often open to oppression, that they are often discouraged, and they are simply sharing their insights. It is never intended for anyone to feel bad, because feeling bad doesn't change any laws. It doesn't change any practices. It doesn't do anything for anybody. So critical race theorists would never argue that we should be trying to make each other feel guilty. That is not going to help. But we can make one another aware, and we can move toward being more equitable. That's what we would hope to do. And unfortunately, House Bill 3979 does not help in that endeavor.
Well, 79. Okay. I was going to say, in fact, that some people would argue that the bill kind of works against itself, because it says that people of any race or sex should not be stereotyping, should not be placing the blame on others, or that any one group is inherently superior to another. And when I read the bill, and I think maybe an outsider who reads the bill says, well, this is kind of going hand in hand with what some of critical race theory, as you've laid out, is saying too. So here's a bill that on the one hand says, well, we're against this, but on the other hand says we're for it.
We're for it.
It's confusing. I want to come back to something. This is one of the tenets that you mentioned that I kind of glossed over, and you've recently brought up. What is equitable versus equality? Because, golly, growing up in Texas and going to red-blooded American schools since I was a wee small lad, we believe in equality here. And so what is this equity of which you speak?
Excellent question, my brother. So equity versus equality. So equality, of course, as you point out, is when we both get the same things, when we get the same resources, when we get the same opportunities, when we have access to the same privilege and power. And that, of course, is quintessentially an American value. But a critical race theorist, right, in critical race theory would say, yes, we believe in equality, that all of us are equal. But in our equalness, we are equally members of this society. We are equally citizens of this nation. We should have the same. But now we have to put it back in its historical framework. We just said that our sisters, women, were not allowed to be citizens until 1920, which means some of us had been citizens since 1776. And others of us are not going to be citizens until much, much later. The African Americans are not going to be citizens until much, much later. So the notion that we're going to get the same ends up being part of the problem, because it doesn't recognize and embrace the experiences and the histories that we have as peoples, as, again, socially constructed groups. So it would be just like saying, okay, Vida's football team versus Dr. Preuss's football team. Vida commits a penalty. Dr. Preuss was going to catch a touchdown pass. Vida goes and pushes him out of bounds to prevent him from catching the pass. It happened. It's over. Let's just go back and keep playing. Preuss's team would be like, no, it doesn't work that. Like, we were about to win the game. They kept us from winning the game. No, we can't just go back to equality. We have to make sure that which was ours, That which was supposed to be ours is given to us so that we can keep competing with the other team. So as you know, in football, as in basketball, and all of our sports, the referee throws the flag. Dr. Robertson, your team engaged in practices that were against the rules of the game. We are going to have to assess. This is not necessarily a punishment for you. This has to do with all the opportunity we took from him. And we are going to move the ball forward. We are going to give you a chance to shoot a free throw. That is an equitable. Equity is giving us not the same, but giving us what we need in order to be successful. And when we all, because we are differently situated in our systems, in our structures, and in our institutions, because we have different experiences with the oppression that has to do with the way we organized ourselves as a society, we need to be interested in making sure that that group who's been kept from catching the ball in the end zone, that group who've been kept from engaging in politics, that group who's been kept from certain jobs and opportunities, that group who's been excluded from education, those groups are not given what they need in order to actually be in competition, to engage in the nation in the same ways as their other brothers and sisters. In order for us to practice equality, we must first engage in equity. We have to help all those groups who we said were not people and were forever supposed to be slaves. That was wrong. Judge Taney, you were wrong. We were wrong as a nation. We need to fix that. All of those groups that we said, because they have a uterus, are they really as smart as we are? No, we were wrong for that. We were wrong. Forgive us, my sisters. We kept you out of the game entirely too long. We need to fix that. To all of those groups that we systematically prevented from having the resources, opportunity, and privilege that this nation promised to all of us, we need to make sure that they get what they need in order to be the full-fledged Americans that were a part of our original declaration to the world.
To kind of capitalize on your sports illustration, do we not have welterweight, middleweight, bantamweight,
That's right.
heavyweight?
That's right.
In boxing and martial arts.
Right.
For that very reason, do we not have junior varsity for that very reason? Is that, that's why we don't have, back in the early 1900s when they used to bring in ringers, professional athletes to help the college team win. That we struck down that as not being fair, right? And that is an example of equity as opposed to equality. Right. And also I want to say that President Lyndon Johnson talked about, you can't start a race when somebody, has unequal footing, unequal leg capacity. And that's what, if we look at a race, around a round track, there are the people they're staggered in where they start.
That's right.
And I guess that's an example of equity from the sports world. And what could be more American than football, right? So, I think that, kind of the way you're helping to illustrate these examples, makes them a little bit clearer and less less fearsome than I think we sometimes hear in the media.
Yes, sir. Well, we hope so. We hope so. Because, again, critical race theory is, as I argued early, is quintessentially an American concept. That it really does is grounded in the notion that we all have the same abilities, that we all have the same potential. And if we can remove the obstacles, the barriers, the experiences, the practices, the rules and policies that are often restricting us from living out our full-fledged potential, then we will be the America that we dream of being. The unfortunate part is many of us are struggling with accepting that the America that we originally built was not the America that we now dream of, that those are two totally different things. And if it was not, if we were not the dream, or as our declaration would say, that we are now trying to perfect this union because we weren't perfect yet. And that if that perfection is going to take a process, and the process is coming to terms with the things that we did very well. There's some things we did very, very well. We are still one of the world's greatest hopes. And then there were some things that we did not do very well at all. And being honest about that assessment of ourselves will lead us to practices that empower and embolden and equip our fellow citizens to be everything they ever dreamed of being. And we finally being the America that we've always dreamed of.
James Weldon Johnson talking about America wasn't America to me.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's Langston Hughes.
Langston Hughes. Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. I've always found that poem very moving, and so I'm glad I got to throw that in. Or James Baldwin said much of the same stuff.
That's right.
And even Martin Luther King. Yes. So it seems like this is really not the bogeyman that it has been made out to be. And I appreciate you for helping us to understand these concepts a little bit better and looking at them in a different light. How can someone find out more information about the center at University of Houston downtown?
Of course, we have a webpage right off of our College of Humanities and Social Sciences. You could easily Google UHD Center for Critical Race Studies. And there, of course, you'll see lots of videos of the programming that we've offered and the courses that we teach and the community outreach that we are engaged in. Because as critical race theorists, we are not simply interested in researching it from the privileged position as professors, but equally engaging in making the world a better place, getting out into our communities and being active agents of that equitable, policies and practices that we want to see in others. So UHD Center for Critical Race Studies, you'll be able to find us there. And we hope you do reach out and come to some of our programming, visit us on campus. We'd love to engage with you in any way that we possibly could.
We just want to inform people so they will know what the issues are, so they will be engaged. So we go out to high schools to register students. We go to colleges, to college campuses like the University of Houston, Rice, Texas Southern. We register students because we want people to be actively engaged and participate in the political process. In addition to that, we actually do forums in terms of public issues such as human trafficking, the immigration issue, the voter ID. We held workshops. This region of the country in particular, women do not participate in the political process at the same level in terms of running for elective office and winning. And maybe it has to do, you tend, in an area where the education level is lower, you tend to have fewer people thinking that there's a need for women to be involved in politics. And I think in our society, we still have biases in terms of thinking that men are more equipped. If you look at candidates who run for office, they ask women questions that they don't ask men. But it is increasingly more important that women run for elective office, that women get elected, because there are issues that will only come to the table and be discussed when women are sitting at that table. Information we hope, be informing the electorate so they will make wise, intelligent choices in terms of the selection of their officials. At least that's our hope.
I want to thank you for joining us here on Public Affairs, Public Access on Houston Media Source TV. And thanks to Dr. Robertson from the Center for Critical Race Studies at the University of Houston downtown for being our guest and for informing us about critical race theory, what it is. Please go out and vote in the special election. And thank you for joining us tonight on Public Affairs, Public Access on Houston Media Source TV. I'm Gene Preuss for Houston's League of Women Voters. Have a good night.
Bye.